So thank you for those of you who have joined us. I'm really excited that we get to do this presentation. And I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Diane Costo. She's the founder and CEO of Symmetry Neuro-Pathway Training. She is a mom on a mission. She struggled with her son, who was placed in various programs to help with behavior-related challenges. And she was introduced to neurofeedback, which she believed saved him and her sanity. She got her start by opening a neurofeedback clinic at a school in Utah. She held educational classes for parents and trained a department of staff to run the clinic and sessions. In 2012, she received approval to teach and certify doctors of chiropractic for an advanced QEEG neurofeedback course and holds several certificates in the field. Diane has since been training doctors and staff to run neurofeedback clinics throughout the United States and has developed Symmetry Neuro-PT Academy to train and certify others in the field. Since 2010, she has continued to educate herself through continuous training and experience in every aspect of neurofeedback and biofeedback services, including sales and support for equipment, education for doctors and technicians, case management, and community outreach. Diane initially launched Symmetry to provide Neuro-Pathway training in facilities and therapeutic boarding schools. She has expanded the company to educate and serve other professionals, programs, schools, and families and provide them easy and affordable access to neurofeedback. She is passionate about helping others address and correct the root cause of many negative characteristics of common problems that one can face, like she did with her son. Symmetry Neuro-PT has an option for everyone looking to maximize the power of their brain, providing hope and peace of mind for themselves and their clients. And just some quick information, if you didn't hear me before, if you have any questions, I'm going to mute everyone during the presentation, but if you have any questions for Diane, please put them in the chat and I'll read those to Diane at the end of her presentation. We'll have our Q&A session. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Tony, for welcoming me. So this is basically what we're going to go over this evening. I'm going to touch on, she already gave a lot of who I am, so I'll condense that part of it. We'll talk a little bit about trauma and technology, how it affects the brain and what happens to people. And we're going to go over the what, why, and how of neurofeedback, basically, and we'll open it up for Q&A. For those of you that aren't very familiar with neurofeedback, you may have some questions for me. So as Tony had mentioned, I got into this field over 10 years ago to help my son who was struggling with impulsivity. Almost every different program, every school that he went to, I would get this phone call. We really love him, but he's not following the program and you need to come and get him. And I went through years of trying to find an environment that would work for him. At the time, I really didn't believe in ADHD. I thought he was, he would come across as a 110% boy with a bad attitude, basically. So people would just shake their heads and not know what to do with them, and he'd get kicked out left and right. So I tried private school, homeschool, boarding school, homeschool, military academy. I sat in front of rooms full of professionals that just did this, shook their head and put their hands up. And even though I tried, I was unable to head this off. And by the time he was going on to 13, he ended up in a school for troubled teens because we really didn't know what to do with them. At one point, he was medicated and lost his personality altogether. So I felt like that was kind of worse than the holes in my wall from the violence and the fighting between him and my older son. But I did whatever I could. He ended up at this boarding school. I'm going to condense the story, like I said. And right about when I got the call, when he was in that school for 3 months, and I got the call to come and get him because he wasn't following the program, I ran into the founder of a neurofeedback company who lived in the Hilton Head Island area, a chiropractor who was just pulling together a neurofeedback system to teach chiropractors how to easily incorporate it. And in the past, it would take 5 years and a fortune to figure out how to provide neurofeedback. So this was just kind of the beginning of 10 years ago of trying to simplify it and make it a little more available. And thank God I was introduced to him. And he said, that's the kind of kid we can help. So I went through his 3-day training, and I took a system that he entrusted into my care. It was a $22,000 system at that point. And I drove from South Carolina to I stayed the middle of nowhere, Utah, where my son ended up in that boarding school. They were I'm so gracious because they were allowed me to come in there. They had an open office area that wasn't being used, and they welcomed me in there to give this a shot because the owner of the program knew all of the different things that I've been through with my son, and he really was out of options. He couldn't be back in the home because he was out of control there. So I drive across the country and set up this system. I start running these neurofeedback sessions on him, and within a couple weeks, you could see the changes in him. He started to calm down. He started to smile more. He started to look more rested. And I shared with the parents at the parent conference then what I was doing and the science behind it. And they were like, bring it on. You know, we've tried everything we can do. We're spending more money than we have, because I did as well, went into deep debt through all of those years. And you know, we've tried everything we can. We don't like the medications. Let's try this. So I ended up enrolling students at that program and running sessions on them from like 9 a.m. until 9 at night, every day of the week and a half day on Sunday. And 100% of them showed some type of positive improvement. And these were students, but also a couple staff members that had ADHD and anxiety wanted to participate as well. And so that's how I came out of the gates. I came out of the gates with this new knowledge of this technology, wondering why I hadn't heard about it for all the years before, but with such positive results too, that every single person in that facility showed some type of positive improvement. I was like, are you kidding me? Why didn't we hear about this? So that's how I launched into this. It's after 40 sessions, my son's impulsivity was gone, literally. So he's the poster child for my company. Not everybody reaches their goals 100%, but that's what was, he didn't have that pause between reacting, and that's what was ruining his life. But since then, as Tony went on, I've done everything I can to get this out there to more people. And that's how I got in the field. It was an ugly roller coaster ride with a lot more details between all of those chapters. And you know, this was him when he finally got out of that boarding school after we got rid of that impulsivity, and he was more functional and happy and healthy, and he's confident and independent now. This was the older one who they fought like cats and dogs throughout that whole time. And my older one is a rock star, literally. So everybody thinks he's the one that gave me trouble. So I always have to put him on here and say, not really. He might have pushed some buttons for the younger one who had no impulse control and created, but no, he's doing pretty good too. So that's kind of my story. And really still am a mom on a mission, because I want other families to not have to go through what we did as long as we did and spend as much as we did trying to look for options. So let's go over this a little bit about what neurofeedback is and how it fits in, now that you know a little more about who I am. Obviously, there's a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual aspects to our health, our mental health, physical health, and behaviors. This is strictly looking at the biological part. We're measuring something now in the brain to be able to look at that aspect of it. A good therapeutic program or therapy obviously includes multiple facets. So evidence-based practice, therapeutic alliance, psychological theories, and here's the neuroscience component that brings all of that together. It's not instead of all of that, but used in conjunction. It's a full picture, full piece of the puzzle. Now, when people are coming into life or going throughout life, we have all of these basic needs. And a lot of you may have seen this type of a chart before. On the bottom part are our basic needs that should be met. If, as we're growing up, if some of those are not, this is why we may develop some of the behavioral and mental illnesses and different things. So you have to have your physiological needs met. You have to have your food, shelter, sleep, clothing, things like that. Then your safety, your personal safety, security, resources, your health, and love and belonging, friendship, intimacy, and beyond that. Especially early in life, if any of those bottom ones are not really fulfilled, we tend to develop different disorders that may manifest like this: PTSD, trauma, stress, ADHD, So this whole list: sleep disorders, attention problems, hypervigilance, learning disabilities, memory, immune to internal cues, emotional numbing, attachment difficulties, all of that can happen for one reason or another in your life. A lot of it has to do with some of those different things not being met somewhere along the way. And all of that affects these different parts of the brain. It's not just one area of the brain, but a lot of these different areas of the brain are affected by all of those things that may have happened to you. So the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, you're hearing more some of these terms about the brain, the amygdala and the fight or flight mode and all of that. And I won't get into too much of the technical stuff, but basically you need to know that your whole brain can be affected when you have had stressors or interruptions in your development as you were coming into life, or if you're under extreme stress, which a lot of us are right now. It's affecting all of these different areas of our brain. Again, and I'm not going to get into reading every single part of this, but just understand the brain is full of networks, and there's communication happening in the brain all of the time. And this is a cool actual video of the different networks communicating with one another in the brain. So it's all of these fibers and these little synapses and electrical activity of communication in the brain that is going on. And we can measure that now. And that's what we do as part of our beginning of our process. So this is how complicated it is in the brain though, but we can put a few sensors on there and pick up that electrical activity and record it. I love that video. I think it's the coolest picture to actually be able to, that they can map out those networks in the brain now. It's fascinating. So it starts with that, measurable. And we know now there are certain particular patterns in the brain that are healthy and the ones that are not healthy. And there's an optimal way that your brain should be able to shift back and forth between being very active, like if you're listening now and paying attention, you're trying to absorb this information, your brain should be producing faster activities. Or when you're winding down and you're getting ready to sleep at night, your brain should be able to start to slow down, and it should be able to shift back and forth in a healthy manner. So this is an optimal zone. If you're stuck too much on that high end where you're shooting off all kinds of fast wave activity when your brain shouldn't be, that lends to anxiety, OCD, schizophrenia, compulsivity, things like that. You got too much of that fast wave activity happening at the wrong time. And I'll tell you, these days, we see way more of that pattern in the brain maps than I've ever seen. And that started before COVID, actually. It was in the last 3 years, I would say. I saw more and more patterns of anxiety, regardless of the diagnosis. We're seeing it in the brain maps. If you look towards the left of the screen, you see some other processing issues that can happen. If you have too much slow wave activity happening at the wrong time in your brain, that can tend to be, you can become impulsive or have ADHD-like symptoms where you can't inhibit yourself. That's where my son, ended up being, where he had not enough fast wave activity in that frontal area. So he just had not enough control of his brain and his actions. And that's why a lot of times they give you a stimulant if you have attention issues, because there's too much slow brainwave activity. When you speed that up, you have more control of your brain. So those are some of that's just a little bit of a look at the zone. If you have very, very slow processing, that may have been long-term drug use, or it may have been a genetic defect in the brain's development, or a traumatic brain injury. You can have, that can also show up as a lot of slow level activity, or Alzheimer's and dementia as well. So we know now that we can measure these things. Again, here's another summary with a little more detail. Brain too fast tends to be anxiety, mania, worry. It's over-aroused, too much fast wave activity. If you're kind of stuck in the middle, that's a person that tends to be like their foot's on the brake. The brain can't keep operating at that high anxiety level, and it starts to protect itself by cocooning you into a depressive mode. And the brakes go on, and your brain says, I can't keep operating at that high level of anxiety, so I'm slowing down now. So you tend to get depressed, lethargy, fibromyalgia, thyroid issues people have in that area as well. Toxins and some drug burnout. Also, you can kind of have that excess idling with a foot on the brake thing. And then the really slow, you're into the ADHD, the head injury, things like that. Very, very slow, dementia, white matter damage. Those are some of the patterns that we know, that we've learned from measuring the brain and from studying it for years. So once we know that information, I'm going to dive into what we do with it. What is neurofeedback? Neurofeedback is actually a method of training those brain waves to alter the structure and the function of the brain. And that sounds pretty extreme, the structure and the function of the brain, but it's true. It happens every time we learn. When we learn something, those little synapses that are communicating, that you saw those networks and fibers in the brain, they actually physically change every time we learn something new. So it happens when at different times in life, you know, when you're growing up and you're just learning everything from the immature brain as you're learning to crawl and talk and make noises, there are physical changes happening in a baby's brain. If you have a brain injury, obviously the brain will compensate. You've probably heard of that before, where there's a brain injury and other areas of the brain start to compensate to try to take over. And again, like I said, throughout adulthood, really anytime we learn something, there are physical changes happening in the brain. So it's not as strange as it seems to say that it's changing the structure and the function of the brain, because that happens on a regular basis when we learn. And just like when you learn to ride a bike, neurofeedback is a long-term permanent change. We've created new pathways in the brain to produce better, healthier patterns. The neurofeedback is also known as EEG biofeedback, and it's a simple learning modality using technology. We use technology to teach the brain how to produce the healthier patterns. So our version with Symmetry, it's painless and drugless and non-invasive. It's safe for all ages. There are different types of neurofeedback out there. Some of them do use a low-level current, and we do not. Ours is non-invasive. So, you know, not all neurofeedback is exactly the same. You always want to investigate and learn a little bit more about the type that you may be looking into doing. Across the board, I have to say, regardless of which type of neurofeedback, I've heard success across the board. So some person might think theirs is better or the other one is better. And I say, from what I've heard when I go to the scientific conventions, is that people are getting good results across the board with multiple methods of neurofeedback. So it's worth looking into. Also, neurofeedback was based on over 50 years of clinical research. It was founded in a university lab. That's where it started. It wasn't just some guru in his office that discovered it. It's actually discovered in the lab. So we do have over 50 years of peer-reviewed university-based research. Those studies are smaller than big pharma studies. So in part, that's why we might not have as much popularity, because there's not the millions and billions of dollars to go into these studies. They're smaller scale university studies, but there are great ones out there on all of these different conditions that you can see on the screen here, especially the ADHD, anxiety. That was some of the earliest stuff that they dealt with, was ADHD and seizure disorders, actually. So it's based on the principle that many of these conditions are actually related to brainwave dysregulation. It seems like a lot of different things. How can one modality affect so many different conditions? But when you think about it, a lot of these things are just being managed by medications. And what is the common factor? It's the brain. And when the brain isn't properly regulated, there's only so many symptoms that can be manifested. There's a lot of labels, but there's only so many symptoms. So regardless of the label, common factor is the brain. That's why so many of them, you know, can be helped with this. When you start to better regulate the brain rather than just medicate to manage, a lot of things can fall into place for people. Also, the beauty of neurofeedback is that once you do start to better regulate the brain, a lot of other therapies that you've engaged in already have more effectiveness. You've kind of completed the circuits. You know, once my son was able to just hold back on that impulsivity, all of the things that he learned from all these multiple programs and everything have clicked in. He's an amazing young man now, and it took reconnecting that area that wasn't quite balanced for him. So I love it that it enhances most other therapies. So let's look a little bit at the why and how. I do like to include, I mentioned briefly that this was started in a research lab, and it's really important to know this. Barry Sterman in the 60s was doing a studying sleep cycles, basically. He had cats in there. He was monitoring their brainwave activity and observing them. He accidentally discovered a new brainwave, and that was exciting. They didn't really know, how exciting until later, but they started to find out could they actually teach these cats to produce more of that brainwave at will? And they went through several processes, and they were able to teach the cats by rewarding them with a little bit of milk and broth every time their brain produced a half-second burst of this new brainwave activity. They'd give them a little more milk and broth, and they're measuring the brainwave activity. I'll show you a picture here. The cat on the left actually had a little cap on their skull, and they were measuring it. Each time they produced a little bit of this new brainwave, they gave them some milk and broth. Those cats continued to produce more and more of that specific brainwave. It was one when they're like still and focused and ready to pounce on a mouse. So that's kind of the brainwave that it was. So it was really cool that they were able to do that, teach an animal how to produce brainwave at will. They didn't have any practical application until Barry Sterman was commissioned by NASA to figure out why the astronauts were developing seizures when they are exposed to hydrogen rocket fuel. So in come the cats. These cats were less fortunate. They didn't get the milk and broth, but they got exposed to hydrogen rocket fuel. And most of them did start to develop the seizures again, except 10 of them. And they realized that those 10 were brought in from the prior study. Those were the 10 cats that learned to produce more of that one particular brainwave at will. So by learning to produce more of that particular brainwave, it changed the structure and the function of their brain enough that they were resistant when they were exposed to a toxin. And that was huge. When they figured that out, they then replicated it on apes. And then they decided to obviously help people with seizure disorder. So they did another study on epileptics, and they had showed about an 80% reduction in grand mal seizures by teaching epileptics how to produce that same brainwave that they did with the cats. So that was published back in 1978, and thank God, because now it has gone so far since then. These are some of the other conditions in the timeline of how these studies started to come out little by little. So it started with the first one with the cats and the epileptics, and then it went into peak performance in ADHD because they noticed the epileptics were becoming calmer and much more focused when they learned to produce more of this brainwave at will. Went into addiction studies, anxiety, learning disorders, all the way up to now. If you go on Google and you search neurofeedback for blah, 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 you're going to find something. There's a whole bibliography from the International Society of Neurofeedback Research that you can find studies on. So it's worth looking into, but that's kind of the timeline of how it started to roll out. Here's a great quote that I like from Frank Duffy. He's a professor and a pediatric neurologist from Harvard Medical School. And he states, neurofeedback should play a major therapeutic role in many difficult areas. In my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it'd be universally accepted and widely used. And I agree with that. Again, we don't have the big pharma support quite yet. We're coming along a little more. And back in, I forget the year this was, but the American Academy of Pediatrics actually at one point declared biofeedback, which that's another name for neurofeedback, EEG biofeedback, as a #1 best level support for attention and hyperactivity behaviors. But a lot of pediatricians didn't see that memo. I've sat in roomfuls of them mentioning that, but they're so busy doing what they've always do that they're not always on top of everything, so you sometimes have to dig for yourself and find some resources. And that's why I'm glad you're attending this, to get a little more info. So neurofeedback, again, it's based on the principle that there's a normal pattern of brainwave activity, and the brain regulates itself based on that normal pattern. If it becomes disrupted, as we talked about throughout, needs not being met, or if there's a physical reason or genetic reason, such as drugs, prescriptions, toxins, poor nutrition. Think about it. Our diet really, our food doesn't contain the nutrients that it used to. So a lot of times you have a deficiency and you don't even know until later in life when some other symptom manifests. So that can also change your brainwave activity. Trauma, long-term stress, things like that we talked about can all change your brainwave activity. So what happens? How does it work? Once again, we're going to look at these brainwave activities, these patterns. We're going to measure that and record that. It's just done by putting a snug cap on your head, squeezing a little gel on there, and then recording and amplifying the brainwave activity. Then we compare it to a brain map database out there of normative patterns. We know the ones that are normal and what is off. So we actually can zoom in on what specifically is going on in your brain, not just based on a label or a diagnosis or anything, but we will actually look at the specific areas of your brain. We'll ask you to report how you're feeling, what your symptoms are. That's this column, the cognitive emotional checklist. I don't know if you can see my cursor, the little hand there, but the CEC column would be how a person was self-reporting what they're experiencing. So they're saying, I've got a moderate level of attention issues. And then the EEG, what we actually measured in the brainwave patterns in those specific areas most responsible for whatever that symptom is, in this case, attention, it shows what level of dysregulation, if at all, there is. So this has high level of dysregulation in the specific networks most responsible for attention. So no wonder they're experiencing that. So on down the line, any of these yellows and reds is a match. So that this person, it shows you validation as to why you've suffered with these different things. And it also shows us that, okay, there is dysregulation in that area now. So there's hope to actually change those patterns through this neurofeedback process. And then there's a bunch of other things that we go over in the report. I won't get into too much detail or we'll run out of time. But the report's really fascinating to find out exactly what's going on in your own brain. And we use that information to determine what the brain needs to learn from there. It's not to diagnose any condition. It's to determine effective neurofeedback protocols. And the whole goal of neurofeedback is to help the brain better regulate. So whatever patterns are off, our goal is to drive the brain towards more normal, healthy patterns so that some of these other things can fall by the wayside. And how it works is once we have all of that information, we know what your goals are, we know what's going on in your brain, we take a couple sensors. I think I actually have a small one here. Instead of the whole cap, it's just a small little silver sensor. And we'll have a couple of those on your scalp, a couple ear clips, and we're measuring the brainwave activity. That gets amplified through a specialized amplifier. It's just a little box that filters out the outside electrical noise in the environment and amplifies the brainwave activity. Goes through the software then, and the software tells us what's going on and analyzes it. It'll be set to reward the pattern that we want your brain to produce. So anytime your brain produces the healthy pattern, you'll be kicked back just watching Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, something online you'll be streaming. That'll play a little bit brighter and louder when you're meeting the healthy pattern. And it'll go a little bit dimmer and quieter when you're not producing a healthy pattern. And I say you, but you have no real control over it. It's between your brain and the software. So anytime, your brain is always going to be producing the electrical activity. When it produces the right pattern that we want, whatever you're watching plays brighter and louder. That's the milk and broth that the cat's got. It's just a little bit of a reward. Think about it. Your brain, you naturally want to see something in a better resolution. So it's not so bright that it's going to agitate you. You set it at a comfortable level. So it's just, you're interested in what you're watching, and your brain will do what it needs to do to see it in a little better resolution, just like your eyes focus when you wake up in the morning. So it's a natural process that happens whether you understand it or not. We've had many clients that don't really have, you can't tell that they even understand what's going on, and they'll respond in a positive way just by that bright or slightly louder to reward them. So that's what happens. A couple sensors gets amplified, you're kicked back, relaxing, and your brain is communicating with the software. And then over time, it's just like when you learn to write with a pencil or play a musical instrument or ride a bike. After a while, there's a new neural pathway there. It changed the structure and function of your brain when you learned to master that new healthy pattern. And that's the goal. It's kind of a relaxed, fun, non-stress, process compared to a lot of things that we go through. So again, the software just kind of automatically detects when you're meeting the right order, rewards you for doing it, and your brain will learn that new pattern. The goal of neurofeedback is not to diagnose or treat any particular condition or disorder. It's just to transform an unhealthy, dysregulated brainwave pattern into a normal, healthy pattern, and to help the brain better regulate, which also balances the central nervous system. And when you're balanced central nervous system, a lot of things can fall into place for you. So it's one of the biggest things is the relaxation and the balancing of the central nervous system. So that's the bulk of it. I wanted to leave time for Q&A, and I can also pull up my software here and do a demo. If you want to unmute and start with some of the Q&A, I can pull that up. I think you're still muted, Tony, but let me go ahead and.
So now's a time if anyone has any questions, if you can put them in the chat and I'll give them to Diane. Kelly did say that when you were talking about the response to the to the Neuro-Pathway training that chocolate ice cream does that for her.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen again a little bit, and so you can see the software. This is the home training version. So we do have software in an office. Obviously, we saw people in an office coming in on a regular basis for the sessions. You need normally a minimum of 20 sessions to create permanent change in the brain. So I don't do less than 30 in my offices, and I recommend at least 30 if you're going to do this at home as well. And this is our simple home training app. Thank goodness this was happening before the whole COVID thing hit. People were transitioning to home training anyways, because coming into the office, sitting in the traffic, all of that was getting to be rough for a lot of people. So we were able to shrink the software and hardware down to where, they can take this home with the sensors and run through the software, just like I'm going to show you here. It walks you right through it. And then I can still see all of the sessions on my end and manage it as needed. So, we don't just send it to them and let them do their own thing. We're constantly monitoring and staying in touch to make sure everything looks good.
Well, I do have one question. What is the average cost for this, and is it covered by insurance?
Good question. So across the country, people were charging anywhere from, I'd say on the low end was like 80 a session, up to some in Boston area, like Vanderkolk's place, he was up above 200 per session. So there's quite a wide range. I kept it on the lower end. I only did neurofeedback in my office, like in Mount Pleasant and everything. We were on that lower end, and I would package it all together for somebody. Right now with the whole home training, we have some people that are set up on a plan where it's about $900 a month, and we have up to plans that are all inclusive in the office that include nutritional consults and a couple add-on programs that are more up in the $5,000 range. Depends on which package you take and whether you're doing it at home. At home is less expensive because there's all the overhead involved. So that's great that we're able to bring it at some of the prices that we have.
Yes.
Insurance is really hit and miss. There's a big push to get it covered, but we're still not always covered. So I don't have somebody on hand that processes insurance, but I encourage everyone to try to call their company and to at least submit for reimbursement. So we try to do some scholarships for people that really need it, and also have different payment plans and stuff to help people.
And I know you mentioned when we talked before that there are some doctors in the area who may offer Neuro-Pathway training or different type of, but in that same, and so it may be something that's covered under insurance, like through a doctor.
Yep, and you just have to check on that. So there are some people out there, like there are two different codes for biofeedback and neurofeedback, and one falls in the mental health realm, and then there's another one that falls into medical, like a 90901 code or something that I don't know if the chiros were able to use that one. They may have, some of them may have been able to for certain conditions. It's really tricky with insurance companies. And then obviously if you have a counselor or a therapist or something and they are okay in billing their time while they're doing the session, that's another possibility. Some people have done that. So it just really have to check into it and decide, who you want to work with, interview whoever you want to work with, learn about the equipment they're using and what style of neurofeedback, and make sure you understand a little bit about it. Not that you have to know all of it, but have an understanding as to whether there's a current being used or not, or and what they base on, how they determine the protocols. You want to ask them that as well. And yeah, the different ones may have different abilities to help you out with the insurance.
And I think you also mentioned that people can use the flex spending.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of people are able to use that towards the Neuro-Pathway training.
Right. Flex spending accounts and the healthcare savings accounts as well.
I have a couple more questions. How long is each session?
So we start with about 10 minutes, then go to 15, 20, we build up. And a typical neurofeedback session is usually thought of as around 30 minutes. When we're doing the home training sessions, I'll have people work up to doing about an hour in a sitting because most people can tolerate that. So you kind of, if you work up gradually, just like you were going to the gym, then you can handle about an hour.
Oh, okay. And
Diane, I have sorry, can I ask a question real quick? I wasn't sure how to succinctly ask this, but it sounds like the patient doesn't have to put effort into the session, right? It's all just whatever their brain is doing naturally.
Right? It's the brain and the software communicating back and forth more than the person trying. Early on, when we train maybe one specific brainwave frequency like alpha, you could almost start to feel the zone that you would get in depending on the brainwave. But now it's so complex that we're training multiple frequencies at one time, and there's no way that you can feel how that feels, but the brain still is able to do it.
Oh, wow. That's great.
So
Thank you.
The best thing that a person can do is just relax. The more they sit there and try to, squint their eyes and think they're going to make it work better, it gets worse because the muscle is involved. So what we do in my office, and I encourage people, is to also we do a little bit of breathing exercises, heart rate variability, biofeedback. You may have heard of that M-wave. We use that as a warm-up exercise, basically to calm people down, because the more relaxed they are, the more their brain can learn. Think about it, if you're anxious and upset, you forget where you put your keys or something, where calm and relaxed, the brain.
And I have one more question. Do you do the initial QEEG, or do clients have to go elsewhere for the initial test?
We do the Qs, yeah. And I've done them in different locations, but we have an office there in Mount Pleasant that we can do the Qs, and I've got a couple other providers that can do them. I've also have been doing this longer than we had the brain maps. So back when my son started, we didn't even have access to the QEGs. So there are some cases where when they just fill out, we have biopsychosocial intake assessments that give me a ton of information. So using those along with looking at your first couple sessions, I have you put the sensors on and I'll analyze those. That gives me enough information as well to choose the protocols if you can't come in to get a mapping done, or if you're too far away from a place that does the mapping. We have those on.
Now, so that looks like that's all the questions. So do we still have time to show the video, or?
Yeah, I think I don't mind doing that. Let me pull this up again. So I started to walk through the software. It was telling you what to do. Plug in the amplifier, put on your sensors. It's going to show you where to put the sensor. This would be one on the scalp and a couple ear clips. So it would walk the person through that. They have their own login, so it's specific to them, what this picture shows and everything. They would check their amplifier connection by clicking here. And this is, I don't have one hooked up, so it's going to say simulation mode. And then I'll say start connection test. And it will show if their connection is good or not. And this is a nice, and obviously we do a Zoom meeting and walk you through the first session or two until you're comfortable with this if you're doing this at home. And then that looks great, it says connection's good, all is green, you click start training. And what's gonna happen, it might change our volume a little bit here, let me see. But I'll do it for a couple seconds and then we can turn it off. All right. So you see the screen fading? Now I wouldn't have slides up here. I'd probably have Netflix or YouTube or something like that. Something more interesting than my slide presentation. And you'll be able to see it just fading a little brighter and dimmer. According to what, it's just playing a fake brainwave activity right now, a pre-recorded version. But that's how simple it is. You just sit back, YouTube, Netflix, and it's just dimming and bright. Are you able to tell the dim and bright, Tony?
No. Might just be me though.
Can't tell? Let me stop. I want to make sure that you can, because it might be the way Zoom, because I transitioned to another screen. Let me try to start again and see if it works. Is it working? You can't see it still? I think
So
that's Zoom.
I think I see the CZ going, like it was changing colors, but is the whole thing supposed to be?
Right now you should see my slides behind
Mm-hmm.
the brain picture, and you should be able to see the fading. It's not showing you what my screen is seeing. Oh, that's too bad.
Oh.
Before on the last Zoom that I tried to demonstrate it on, it just wouldn't
Wow.
show the fading. Oh,
So you
sorry.
could zoom. So I see, like you talk about the mapping and with the sensors, and you may have said this, and I do have ADD, so sometimes I miss things, but do you put the sensors on certain spots based on what your brain mapping showed?
Yes. Yep. We would tell you where to place the sensors, and yeah, the software then, the picture of the head would show you also where to put it. We would tell you, and then it would show you.
That's great. And so you're talking about the at-home equipment, and you said it was $900 a month to do the sessions at home. So when people do that, do they actually purchase the equipment, or is it kind of like it's on loan pretty much?
Yeah, I usually don't sell it to consumers, and they don't need it because once they're done with their session, this is useless unless we have purchased more credits for them to use on sessions. So, and I can, customize if there's a family and more than one person that needs it. We'll talk about that. The prices aren't, super set in stone, especially during this time of people need it more than ever.
Diane.
Yes.
So what about people who are on medicine? Do you encourage them to be off of medicine when they get the preliminary testing done, or does that make a difference?
So
because that is altering brain chemistry.
It does alter the brain chemistry to an extent, but we still usually can see the underlying patterns in the brainwave activity. Even though those medications are kind of masking the outward symptoms, a lot of times the underlying patterns are still there. So we don't want somebody to come off of the medication unless they were doing that anyways. However, it's really important to know throughout the neurofeedback process that we do recommend that you revisit those doses every 10 sessions, because we are changing the neural pathways, and that increases neurotransmitters in the brain, which makes the medicine more potent. So we always like you to be in really close contact with your prescriber to hopefully gradually reduce that. Most people are okay with gradually reducing their meds.
Right.
But you do have to be careful. There are times where the prescriber doesn't understand it, and it can really backfire on you because you're having too much medication in your system. So we do really want people to pay attention to that, but we don't expect them to get off before they start it, just gradually as they go.
Do you,
So Diane, is it difficult to get your physician to work with Symmetry so you can get them both on the same page? Have you found?
It depends on the person. The ones that have been willing to make an appointment, talk to me and understand it, that haven't been exposed to it before, they've been great to work with. But you will get a couple stubborn ones that don't get it and that aren't willing to take a couple minutes to talk to me.
yeah.
So I'm here and I'll try, and then there are some I've had parents that just take it in their own hands because they do anyways. They don't give the kids the medicine on the weekend, or they don't give it to them over the summer if it's something like ADHD meds, Parents, that has to be they have to be confident with that. Psychiatric meds and stuff, you can't be doing that. You just cannot just stop on your own. You have to really work with your provider. So, but I'm always here and willing and excited about talking to those ones that don't really understand it yet. We need more of them to understand this process. Yeah.
So do you feel that this is for treatment resistant, or like you were talking about your son, you had done like so many things.
Yeah.
So like for people who've had, multi levels of different kinds of care, do you feel like this is a better option and you see better results in that area than someone who has maybe mild ADD or something?
So that's a good question. I mean, is it for people that are treatment resistant? I say yes, because a lot of who I first started working with were the ones that were, were running out of options elsewhere. But that being said, we have a lot of people that use this, business people, peak performers, they're Olympic athletes and peak performers, professionals that are using this. So anyone, again, the common factor is the brain. You can always improve your brain and your brainwave patterns. So it's across the board, from the extreme to the people that really just use this as peak performance, which we have a lot of those. There's long-term people, they want to do 1 or 2 sessions a month just to stay on top of their game. Both.
I was thinking with CBT.
So Diane, is it a session a day? Do you go once a day for 30 days? I mean, how does that work?
So if you're doing it at home, a lot of people want to, get the most bang for their buck, and the best pricing really is doing that for a month and doing 1 a day and working up to even 2 a day, doing 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening. So
Okay.
as you can get in that 30-day period, we're having really good results with. And back in the beginning, they talked about 2 to 3 sessions a week, and that's what we'd do in the office. That's enough for people to get into the office. That's a lot of appointments. But we're finding and I actually did more than that on my son early on because he was running out of time, and he was successful with it. And throughout the years, I've tested it more and more, and we're finding great results with getting it in pretty quickly.
Okay.
That's great.
As long as you have to be cautious of is if somebody's getting a little too fatigued, or if they haven't eaten or had enough water around the time of their session, they might get a slight dull headache that'll go away in a day. That's about it for side effects.
Wow. So this makes me think of like CBT and DBT, but this actually helps you retrain your brain without having to put quite so much effort into it. Like with CBT, you have to really put a lot of effort into it, and it can be frustrating and exhausting. But it sounds like this does a lot of the same things, except that you're not having to put quite so much homework into it, I guess.
Right. It's really making that change, that neurological change. And of course, the other things that you do, like I said, the other therapies that you do are going to be much more effective. They're going to click in a lot quicker if you get past that stuck point. For a lot of people, they go to therapy and they just, get to that point where they feel like they're plateaued and they're kind of stuck. This can get you past that and be able to move forward. So, yeah, with a little less.
That's great. And I noticed on the scale, it mentioned like schizophrenia and some other things on the brain scales, the slow processing and the fast processing.
Right.
But is it being used to help with some of those conditions as far as you know, like with negative symptoms or positive symptoms?
Yeah, it has been. There's studies out there on it. I haven't specifically worked with a lot of people with schizophrenia. I have more the anxiety and depressive, people that aren't quite at that diagnosis level. But yeah, the studies are good on it. Even with Alzheimer's, dementia, Alzheimer's is a little aggressive, but still certain things like that, they're getting some good results with.
What does it do with Alzheimer's and dementia? Like help with memory? Is it mood?
Yeah, it can slow the progress a little, and with the dementia, it makes some slight improvements too. Alzheimer's, when it gets really aggressive, it's not as good as if you can catch in the dementia stages for memory, post-stroke, or that memory thing as you're getting older. It can help them.
Great. Well, anybody else have any other questions?
Here's a little investment versus expense graph I like people to think about too. Long-term costs of traditional therapies versus this. It does seem expensive when it's out of pocket, but if you put it into perspective, some of your co-pays over 5 years are going to be more expensive than doing this for yourself. I've got some resources in here. I want to put these up real quick so if somebody's watching this later, they can look these up. This Sterman, and this really goes through the beginning foundations. Even though it mentions epilepsy in this title, it also touches on some of the other conditions and why neurofeedback works on them. So this is a really great one from Sterman, who discovered it. Nostra gets into a lot of good information here. And yeah, so those are some of the key research things that people may be interested in.
So Diane, once you get once you go through your sessions and you get on a path, I mean, do you have to go back for like touch-ups, or I mean, how do you sustain it?
So some people are fine and they don't have to go back or want to. Like my son, for instance, it got rid of his impulsivity. It hasn't come back for him. But we do have some of the people, like I mentioned, that like the way they feel when they do this, and they want to continue just as a membership, and they'll just do 1 or 2 sessions a week ongoing. It really depends on the individual and what they want to do, but the science shows that there are changes in the gray and white matter in the brain. This is the last study I have listed on this slide. There are physical changes after 20 sessions. So, you know, it depends on where you are. And if you live a super stressful life and eat a horrible diet or get into a car accident or something, you can have setbacks.
Okay.
But some people really reach their goals and they're fine, and I haven't seen them.
Wow.
So I have a couple more questions from the chat. Does this help with psychogenic non-epileptic seizures?
Interesting. So most of the seizures I've heard great results with. There's so many different little, you know, as that name implies, there's a lot of different types of seizures, and some of them they're a little bit unknown and they're not sure. But that was the first thing that Sterman found the brain to help with. So it's really worth giving it a shot.
That's great. And then are the changes, you mentioned like the permanent changes in the beginning, but are the changes permanent, and how often do you recommend a tune-up?
Changes are permanent and long-term. And the tune-up, I just recommend if somebody wants. I don't really require that. You know, as long as they get in that foundational 30 to 40 sessions is a minimum in my office. It depends on what we see in their map and their goals and their medications, but whatever we discuss and we go through that recommended minimum, that's fine. You know, if they've reached their goals, they don't have to come back.
Wow.
That's great.
Back to that seizure question too. I didn't look up the definition of that particular one, and you rattled it off, but I'm like, okay, what exactly, which seizure disorder was that? It might have been one of the ones that was not really a seizure, that appears to be a seizure, but a lot of times it's caused by maybe anxiety or blood pressure issues or things like that. We've had success with those as well, the ones that look.
Oh, wow. That's great. Someone mentioned that it's very hard to treat, so that's really encouraging to hear that.
Teenage girl, you know, passing out in school that was suffering with that, and they're sending her all over the place, and they couldn't find it. They didn't think it was a real seizure, so it was like a non-epileptic seizure. She was doing great. It's so exciting to help her.
How about FND or functional neurological disorders?
I'd have to look that one up. And if brain, you got a good shot of if you can better regulate the brain, helping it. That's all I can say. But I would definitely look into that a little more. Google it. You know, Neurofeedback 4, whatever you guys are thinking of. See what you can come up with. This top link, the International Society for Neurofeedback Research, this one has a extensive bibliography, so you can dive in and look at it. And if it's for myself, if it's something like I haven't specifically worked with, I have people that I do continuing ed with 3 times a week. We hop online for an hour at a time, and we can bounce cases. You know, my mentors and the founder of the BrainMap database. So I can always take one of my clients' cases and put it out there and get opinions from people around the world. So we support each other with that too.
Wow.
And that there is a really good research paper on. So I feel pretty good about being able to help some of those unique things too that we can't find a paper on yet.
That is great. That is awesome. And I just wanted to let everyone know this session has been recorded. Information will be shared from like the chat and everything, but it will be available. We'll probably put it on our social media and our website. So it will be available, so you can go back through and look at the slides if you want to look into that a little more. And so someone asked.
Here's another question. Do you see it?
Let's see. Oh, Could you please repeat the estimate of pricing for the 20 sessions?
So the pricing in my offices, at least, is anywhere from $19.97, that's $1,997, up to, I think our bigger 40 session package with all of the bells and whistles and consults and everything is up to $5,400. So anywhere from under 2,000 to 5,400.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was very interesting, and I can't wait to share this with everyone. Thank you for allowing us to record this as well and be able to share this information.
You're welcome. I like to get the word out there. It really can make a difference in a lot of people's lives.
Oh, yes. Yes, definitely. All right. Well, that's everyone saying thank you very much, Diane. Thank you. It was a great presentation. We loved it. Thank you.
It was. Thank you so much, Diane.
Right. You're very welcome. You all stay safe, and we'll see you again sometime.
All right.
Thank
you too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.